Good afternoon, class. I'm going to talk to you today about the first philosopher that we're going to meet in our Western philosophy class. His name was Thales, Thales of Miletus, and he lived around 590 BCE. So we're talking about about 600 years before the time of Jesus of Nazareth, just to give you a little bit of a Western calendar perspective on that. So about 600 years before the time of Jesus of Nazareth. He is considered a Greek philosopher, but he's not really from Greece. He's from a colony of Greece across the Greek peninsula, across the Aegean Sea, in a place where is modern day Turkey. Back in the ancient world, it would have been called Asia Minor. And so there he is from a small little seacoast town called Miletus. I'm giving you way too much information. But anyway, he's not from Greece proper. He's from a colony of Greece. The Greeks were great seafarers. They went through all the Mediterranean and had little colonies in Sicily, Syracuse, in the southern little boot tip of Italy, in a place called Elea, and they traded with Phoenicia, they traded with Egypt, and certainly they were over in Asia Minor, and they established a little Greek colony. If you think about colonies as being something similar like to what the United States has done in getting the Panama Canal, or in getting the little island of Puerto Rico, or in going into the Pacific and getting Guam or Midway. Great empires, if you have the military technology, the naval technology, to be able to take land and colonize it. I mean, that's what I should say countries with more superior weapons and more firepower can do. They colonize. So anyway, the Greeks had colonized a small little coastal city across the Aegean Sea called Miletus. That's where Thales was from, and he was kind of an eccentric guy. He already was engaged in mathematical speculations, and he kind of like was one of those Renaissance men who like philosophy and like speculation, likes investigation of things, and maybe kind of like a primitive version of Stephen Hawking's, if you want to think about it that way. So I'm going to show you some examples from my desk, and I want you to see if you can gauge what I'm trying to ask you. Think about this as being like a little word puzzle. So the first thing I want to show you, you can't really see it really well through this plastic bag, but I'll open it a little bit so hopefully the camera can zoom in on this. And inside here is called potting soil, okay? You can't see it really well, but that's potting soil, the kind of stuff that you use for your plants when you're about to plant your succulents or whatever. Okay, so that's the first little item that I want you to consider. The next thing I'd like you to consider is this air pump that you use for your mattresses when you have guests over and they won't need to sleep somewhere, and so you pump up the mattress. Okay, so there's an air pump. I also have this that you will see in a second. A candle. That's the third item. And of course, not last but not least, this bottle of ethos water. I'm trying to tell you something, class. What's the puzzle? What am I asking you for? What am I asking you to identify? Well, some of you might already get it, and some of you go, nah, dude, I'm not getting this at all. Okay, I'm showing you the four elements. The four elements. So we've got earth. You were thinking potting soil, right? Kind of hard to think outside the box. Potting soil, earth, wind. I mean, I didn't know how else to bring wind into this little environment, this little desk room that I have. Earth, wind, fire, and water. And these four elements were already well known in the Greek world, also in the Asian world, the four elements. Most people already had some primitive scientific thinking that was going on at around the year 600. Because if you're walking on the ground, you know that's one kind of element. You certainly can't breathe the dirt. So there's dirt, earth, then there's wind, the thing that's going through our lungs, our pneuma, meaning our lungs, um, is another kind of element. Earth is compacted and firm. Air is breezy and it's moving through. But then you can't breathe this. This is another element that's way different than wind, right? You don't want to get wind can hit your face. You don't want this on your face. It's a different element. And of course, once they got down to the seaside, they could see that there was yet another element, not just air and wind and the ground that you're standing on, but actually this liquid environment called water. So even the primitive Greeks, the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, the Mycenaeans, all the people in the ancient Mediterranean world and in the Asian world, they already identified four basic elements. And this is interesting because most of the world civilizations at that time, whether you're talking about Persia, whether you're talking about Egypt, whether you're talking about Rome, the Ming Dynasty, or whatever, or any African tribe, most of those pre-scientific civilizations, they explain things mythologically. So when there was an earthquake, a volcano, a thunderstorm, a huge rain or a deluge that wiped out everything, a famine, those kinds of things, a plague of locusts, anything like a tsunami, if you happen to live near the seaside and an earthquake happened, then you get this big tsunami. Most of those kinds of early phenomenon or natural phenomenon were explained mythologically. So even though you have some primitive pre-scientific speculation going on about the four different elements of the world, most things in nature, most natural phenomena are classified as mythological explanations. There's a mythological explanation to them, right? Thales was a little bit different because he certainly would have been in the Greek world and he would have known about Demeter and he would have known about Athena and he would have known about Hephaestus and Poseidon and Kronos and Zeus. He would have known about Achilles and Odysseus. He would have known all about that. And he would have known about Persian gods, Ishtar, and he would have known about, Set down in Egypt, and all of the Greek and the Egyptian gods. He would have known about mythology, but Thales was a little bit of a speculative kind of thinker. There's a legend of him supposedly going down to Egypt and telling the pharaoh the height of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Now, this would have been interesting because to measure the height of the pyramid, it requires, you can't drill, you can't go to the cone of the pinnacle of the pyramid and drill down into the pyramid to find the true, height and depth of the height of the pyramid. You can't drill down through it. And if you take a rope and measure down the side slope, that's going to be longer than a straight drop, right? It's longer, it's an angle. So that's not going to give you the height. So how did you come up with it? And apparently, according to the legend, he figured that if he got a stick, and I don't know how, but he knew the height of a stick. Let's say it's 6 feet tall. And he went out right when he knew the sun was casting a shadow. And if he knows the length of the shadow and he knows the height of the stick, then he also measures the length of the shadow of the Great Pyramid. And so by knowing the ratio between the length of the shadow, he's able to find out what the height of the Great Pyramid is. It's basically a proportion or a ratio. So some of you might find stuff like that interesting, but Thales was an interesting guy, right? He's not just going in for mythological explanations of things. He likes to use logos or reason. And let me stop here to say that some of the questions that you need for quiz 1 are going to be embedded in this lecture, so I'll stop just to give you a couple of them. First of all, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and let me stop there for a second, pre-Socratic. Can you hear the word pre, before, pre-Socratic? So these philosophers taken as a group, beginning with Thales, then going into Anaximander and Zeno and Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosophers are important to us, in those of us in the modern world, not because they're correct. Their early scientific explanations of things aren't correct. They certainly don't hold up during scientific investigation, but they're still important to us because they are breaking away from mythology And that's important in world history because what you're seeing in people like Thales is the beginning of the internet. You're seeing the beginning of electromagnetism and electricity. And you're saying, wait a minute, looking at different things in the universe and speculating about earth, wind, and fire is not the beginning of the internet. Yes, it is, because you're starting to ask, is there something underneath? Is there something in nature that has a rational energy or force that can be explained in all things? So you are, in a sense, asking scientific questions, primitive scientific questions, but eventually those primitive scientific equations give us the Hubble telescope and the Hubble satellite and nanotechnology and all this stuff that we can do with the genes and gene manipulation and gene splicing and genetically modified organisms. How do we do all of that? Because people started to ask, are the gods in control here? Or are there other things in nature that we can look for? Now, what is the goal of the pre-Socratics? The goal of the pre-Socratics. That's another question that you'll see in the quiz 1 questions. The goal of the pre-Socratics, and that is to identify the one fundamental Lego or principle in all things. Right? They are looking for the one element in all things. I have a Lego here on my desk. They're looking for the one fundamental Lego that explains all things. It's in every body or thing. It's in human bodies. It's in the air that we breathe. It's in the water that we drink. It's in this desk, this piece of wood desk that you can't see. It's in every single thing, the fundamental Lego. That's what they call the search for the one Lego or element or particle in the many, in all the different things, in birds, rocks, trees, clouds, gases, stars, suns, planets, dark matter. They're looking for the one fundamental element, the search for the one in the many. Okay, so hopefully I gave you some answers that you'll need to know when you take quiz 1. So anyway, back to Thales. Thales is kind of an interesting guy, as I speculated about. And one day, I brought something in from my, canyon side over here in Spring Valley, this dry grass. One day he's watching a cow eat some grass. And you'll see that if you look in, I gave you a PDF file of of this book. And if you can see this primitive drawing here right over here, there is a cow. This is Thales looking at a cow, and the cow is munching on some dried California grass. And he's kind of engaging, and there's no HBO, there's no Netflix, there's no sporting events or something else to occupy his mind, right? It's a primitive world. He's looking at this cow chew grass, right? And if you've ever been in the country and you ever seen animals chew, they kind of get that far away look in their eyes, and they're just kind of going, they're just chewing the cud. And Thales sees this, and maybe it's like one of these moments like when Isaac Newton is sitting underneath a tree and an apple falls on his head, and he goes, gravity. Everything falls down to the earth. There's some kind of force that can be measured that always pulls things down. So maybe he's having one of these Isaac Newton moments looking at the cow chew the grass, and he's wondering if somehow something in the grass is related to the milk that the cow produces. Now think about that question for a minute. He's wondering if something in the grass that the cow is eating ends up in the little jar of milk that a farmer gets when they milk a cow. Is there some connection? And Thales begins to think, yeah, going back to this little Lego, this little blue Lego, he tends to think that there's something in this grass, right? It's pretty dry right now, but at one time this grass was kind of green. Thales believes that some little particle of the grass here, some little water particle, was broken down by the cow's chewing and then ended up going through the cow's stomach to then end up in the cow's udder that then ended up in the milk. What is milk mostly? I mean, according to what science tells us, milk is 80% water. So Thales is beginning to think that there's some link between the grass, obviously greener grass right now. I couldn't show you any green grass right now. Everything on my hillside's dead. But anyway, there's something in the grass that also is found in the milk, and he thinks that it is a water particle. So now, bing, this light is going on with Thales where he's thinking, I think of the four elements that we have that we know about, right? He knows that there's four elements. There's earth, there's wind. Sorry that I'm going through this. There's fire, and there's water. He's thinking that this one must be the most fundamental of all those four elements. And if you think about it, he's got a little bit of an argument. Certainly, if you look at the human body, there's tears in our eyes can form tears. There's water in our saliva. There's water in our blood. There must be some liquid element of blood. There's certainly water on a humid day. You'll feel it in the air. Our bodies produce sweat. If you dig underneath the ground, you'll oftentimes find water. If you're in a cave, sometimes under the ground, you'll see water kind of weeping through the rock. And so he's thinking, yeah, water must be the most fundamental Lego of all things. I'm rich. Publish me. I'm Scientific American. In the journal, I've finally published my finding. Water is the fundamental element. Now, is Thales correct? No, he's not correct, but he's pushing human beings away from mythos into logos. And that's why it's important, okay? He's looking for the fundamental particle that we're all still looking for if you think about it. So if you kind of think about it, I have this little Lego figure here, and I kind of think about it as kind of being this little Japanese pagoda. You've seen those little beautiful little kind of roof architecture that they'll have in Japanese architecture. So let's just go ahead and say that this is a Japanese pagoda. Notice it's made out of a lot of different Legos. But see this blue Lego right here? What basically Thales is saying is that in all things, you'll always find one fundamental Lego that always is going to be in every Lego, in every form, whether it's a building, whether it's a tree, whether it's a human body, whether it's anything, whether it's in the earth, you're always going to find this one blue Lego in every single form. So he thinks it's the most fundamental element of all, water. Okay, it's kind of interesting, right? It's the first little, let's give him some props. Thales is not talking about ethos right now. He's not talking about ethics. He's not talking about epistemology. He's not thinking about, do we know anything? Is anything real outside of my mind? He's not interested in those other two branches of philosophy, epistemology and ethics. He's focusing purely right now on metaphysics, the nature of being. It's the nature of physical being, right? Cosmology is what they call it in the ancient world, cosmology. He's focusing in on the reality of change, that all things break down into from one form and then evolve into another form. And he's thinking, what is the most fundamental Lego that's always in all forms, whether it was first in this one form or then it broke down like what happens with the grass turning into milk. Something turned into milk, but there's still something linking those two things, the grass and the milk, and that linking thing is always a water particle. So he's looking, if you think about it, he's thinking subatomically. He's thinking molecules. Even though he can't see them, he can't intuit them, he can't visualize them, he knows that there has to be some link between the grass and the milk. Something had to be in the grass that now has appeared in the milk. Welcome to science. Well, there's this other philosopher who is thinking about this question, and you'll see him also in chapter 1. And he's looking at this spilled glass of water on the table. And he's the next philosopher that we're going to see in our tour. His name is Anaximander. Anaximander. He's also from the Greek colony of Miletus. He actually is a colleague of Thales. They know each other. And when he comes across Thales' theory, whether Thales spoke it to him or whether it was written down, I'm not sure the method of transmission of how Anaximander learned of Thales' theory. They were colleagues. I'm sure that they spoke. He starts his own investigation and he's going, you know what? This water theory just doesn't hold up because there's one fundamental problem with it. How do you say that how can water be the fundamental Lego of all things? Because you can't explain any water in fire. As a matter of fact, when you pour water on top of this fire, it puts the fire out. So it's diametrically opposed to water. Fire and water are just completely two different. If there was some element of water in fire, well, then as soon as you poured water onto the fire would even spark up higher, like when you add oxygen or something to it, it even intensifies. But that's not what happens. When you add water to fire, it puts it out. So he says it can't be water. As a matter of fact, you don't find any water in the desert. This idea that there's water in rocks, no. The water that you see in rocks is water that's coming from rain or maybe some kind of moisture that's making its way through the cracks of a rock. It's not because there's water in a rock. There's no water in a rock, but water can make its way through rock with, rain or some other kind of way that the water percolates through rock. But that doesn't mean that there's water in the rock. So Anaximander is kind of going through this theory, and he's kind of like giving us, if you think about it, the first kind of scientific debate that we know about, going back and forth on this philosophical, it's not scientific, but it's certainly a philosophical debate. And they're going back and forth. And he's going, if everything was made out of water, why wouldn't the earth have just returned back to a water medium? I mean, if you think about an ice cube, eventually it's going to go back to its natural, at room temperature, it's going to return to its watery liquid state. And that's what Anaximander thinks, is that if everything was made of water, clouds, rocks, trees, earth, mountains, human beings, if we're all made of water, everything would just kind of return back into water if you gave it enough time. But that doesn't seem to be happening. I don't know about that theory too much, but anyway, you can see how Anaximander is kind of going through Thales' theory and he's rebutting it. He's kind of finding flaws in it. So what does he propose? Well, Anaximander is kind of interesting because he says the theory or the fundamental Lego that I'm looking for cannot be Earth, because Earth is kind of like, in opposition to water, and water is in opposition to fire. It cannot be any one of the four elements. It can't be. Anyway, so he says it has to be even something more fundamental. Let's just go ahead and say that this Japanese pagoda, if you think about this bottom level here, this bottom yellow thing, he says it has to be something underneath all things, whether it's in some kind of wood product, like a Japanese building made of wood mostly, or whether it's made of my human body, or it's made of water. It has to be something. It can't be one of the four elements because they sometimes are in opposition to each other. It has to be even something more fundamental, something that can join in to any one of anything. It can be found in rocks, trees, diamonds, stars, dark matter, anti-gravity, whatever element that you're talking about. It has to be something found in all things. It can be found in all things. And he ends up calling this thing the boundless. And at first, when I first learned about this in college, like as your age, college student, I go, the boundless, man, I was writing the boundless. The teacher also said it was called the unlimited. The unlimited. I was going, okay, I'm taking notes. Unlimited, the boundless. What does he mean? But if you think about it, Anaximander is kind of deep because he seems to be saying something like what we understand to be energy. Energy. It's something that can be found in all things, but it doesn't belong to any one thing in particular. It's always within the one thing. So Anaximander is saying, let's just go ahead and say that some super collider in Switzerland, Fermilab, that's, the CERN project, SCERN, CERN, And I'll show you some little kind of like annotations to let you know about the super collider that we have over in Europe, built underneath the ground. I think it's like a 26-mile oval where they have the super collider that's accelerating subatomic particles at almost at the speed of light to go cracking into each other. They have sophisticated cameras to try to measure the moment that these two subatomic particles collide at the speed of light, and they're trying to find the one particle that Anaximander was looking for and what Thales was looking for. They're still trying to find what some people call the God particle. Some people think we already found it. It's called the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson, named after this physicist named Alan Higgs. I don't know if we've actually found it yet. I think that would be amazing if in this great long study that's been going on for centuries, and more accelerated now that we have quantum physics and we have quantum mathematics and we have the technology to begin to really look at subatomic particles. It would be amazing to say, oh yeah, we already found it. Nah, I think it's still down the road, because they keep doing collisions and they keep finding out things like quarks and neutrinos and all these different names that they find out with each subatomic collision that produces new leptons and things like that. There's all kinds of things that are still coming out. I don't think we have found the fundamental particle, but Anaximander seems to be saying, let's go ahead and say that we find the fundamental particle. Let's just say that we finally say, this is it. This is the God particle. This is the thing that Anaximander and all the pre-Socratics were looking for. What Anaximander would say, nah, because once we find this particle, if we could collide it and break it down even further, we would find out that underneath every single element or subatomic particle is something called the boundless energy, something that is in every single element that we have, but itself is just infinite, and it exists in every subatomic element or particle. It's the underlying energy of the universe, and it's infinite. It's boundless. So that's what I think he's heading for. And remember, we're kind of speculating here as to what he meant. So he's not saying he knows what it is. He's just saying, I think it's something underneath whatever particle or element that we end up finding. It's something underneath it, and it's called the boundless. And so that's kind of interesting that you have people talking on this level 600 years before the time of Christ, when all they have at night, no, they don't have electricity. This is what they go to sleep at night when it's too late. They put out the candle. They wake up when the roosters are crowing. There's cows, and there's some primitive technology that's available. They can make buildings. There's architecture. There's some primitive. There's sculpture. There's artisans, and there's weavers and people who know how to put dye in clothes, and they know how to get bronze and iron. Sure, there's primitive technology that human beings going, but this is 600 years. They don't have surgery. They don't have antibiotics. They don't have anything like that. And to think that in this primitive time in world history, in countries like, in cultures like Greece or in the Mediterranean world, and even in India and in China, where they were also thinking about things like the yin and the yang and the Tao, and things like Dharma, these underlying principles of all things, that what they're ultimately looking for. And right around the same time, right, 600 years before the time of Jesus of Nazareth, there's this big explosion of scientific and philosophical speculation that starts to exist in the Mediterranean world and in Asia and in the Middle East, dealing with what is underlying all things.